In the collective memory of a nation, some figures seem to be etched in stone. Their images so familiar they feel less like people and more like monuments. For half a century, Barbara Pierce Bush was one such figure. We see her in our mind's eye, the radiant nimbus of snow-white hair, the signature triple strand of pearls, the warm yet knowing smile that could turn to a look of flinty resolve in an instant. She was the matriarch, the enforcer, the unshakable bedrock of a political dynasty that commanded the world stage. She played the part so perfectly, for so long, that we assumed the public performance was the whole story. We were wrong. Behind the steadfast First Lady and the fiercely protective mother was a woman forged in a world that no longer exists, a woman whose entire life was a masterclass in navigating the vast, often painful chasm between private grief and public duty. Her story is not one of simple, stoic strength, but of a strength that was earned through unimaginable loss, a quiet resilience built upon the foundations of a secret, lifelong battle with depression, and a personal code of ethics that was often far more complex than the political party she represented. To truly understand the formidable woman she became, we must first travel back to the very beginning, to the privileged, rule-bound world of Rye, New York, and meet the young girl who was, in many ways, the last debutante of a bygone American era. Barbara Pierce was born into a world of supreme, almost dizzying confidence. The date was June 8, 1925, and the Roaring Twenties were in full cry. In the Tony suburb of Rye, a manicured enclave of wealth and status on the Long Island Sound, life was an elegant procession of tennis matches at the country club, sailing regattas, and formal dinners. This was the heartland of America's East Coast establishment, a world governed by old money, old names, and an unwritten but ironclad set of social rules. The Pierce family were not just residents of this world, they were pillars of it. Barbara's father, Marvin Pierce, was the handsome, charismatic, and powerful president of the McCall Corporation, the publisher of the wildly popular women's magazine McCall's. He was a man at the center of media and advertising, a titan of a booming industry. Her mother, Pauline Robinson Pierce, was a beautiful society woman from a prominent Ohio family, whose own father had been an Ohio Supreme Court justice. Barbara grew up in a sprawling, comfortable home with cooks, maids, and a chauffeur, a life of effortless privilege. But the emotional landscape of her childhood was far more complex. She was the third of 4 children, and from an early age she felt the particular invisibility of the middle child. Her older sister Martha was beautiful and accomplished. Her older brother James was the athletic son, and her younger brother Scott was the baby. Barbara, by her own admission, was the fat, funny one, the bookish athletic girl who never felt she could compete with her sister's beauty. This feeling was relentlessly reinforced by her mother. Pauline Pierce was a complex and often difficult woman, a product of an era that placed immense value on a woman's appearance. She was prone to bouts of dark, depressive moods and possessed a sharp, critical tongue, which she often aimed at her middle daughter. Barbara would later write with unflinching honesty about the constant arguments with her mother, the cutting remarks about her weight, her clothes, her looks. "I was a very happy fat child," she recalled, but the constant criticism left a deep and lasting mark, a quiet wound of insecurity that she would carry for the rest of her life. In this challenging emotional environment, she found a lifeline in her father. Marvin Pierce was her hero. He was jovial, kind, and adored his daughter, nicknaming her Bar. He shared her love of sports and filled the house with a sense of fun and optimism that was a direct antidote to her mother's pessimism. It was from watching her parents' dynamic that Barbara formed the core philosophy of her life. She saw that one could, like her mother, dwell in sadness, or, like her father, one could actively pursue joy. As she wrote in her memoir, "I learned that you can choose to be happy or you can choose to be miserable. I chose happy." It was not a simple Pollyanna-ish belief. It was a survival strategy, a conscious and lifelong act of will forged in the crucible of a difficult mother-daughter relationship. Her education was a tour of the institutions designed to shape the daughters of the elite. After attending the local public school, she was sent to Rye Country Day School and then to Ashley Hall, a prestigious all-girls boarding school in the genteel, sun-drenched city of Charleston, South Carolina. At Ashley Hall, the curriculum was as much about social polish as it was about academics. Barbara thrived. She was popular, outgoing, and a natural leader. She excelled at sports, particularly swimming and tennis, and embraced the social life of a young debutante in training, joining the junior league and honing the social skills that would serve her so well in the years to come. She was being perfectly groomed for the life that was expected of her, to graduate, perhaps attend a year or two at a prestigious women's college, and then marry a suitable young man from a similarly powerful family. In the fall of 1943, she began her freshman year at Smith College, one of the nation's premier institutions for women. She was on the prescribed path, a bright, promising student with a world of possibilities seemingly ahead of her. But just a few months later, during a Christmas dance in Greenwich, Connecticut, her life would take a sudden and irreversible turn. The dance was held at the Round Hill Country Club, a glittering affair filled with the sons and daughters of the East Coast elite. Barbara, home for the holidays, was there with friends. Across the dance floor, she saw a tall, handsome, and slightly goofy 17-year-old boy named George Herbert Walker Bush. He was a senior at the elite Phillips Academy in Andover and was wearing a wildly colored pair of socks. He asked a friend to introduce them, but by the time the introduction was made, the band was playing a waltz, and he, not knowing how to waltz, asked her to sit one out and talk. They talked for the entire song, and then the next one, and the one after that. By the end of the night, something profound had happened. As Barbara would write years later, "I could hardly breathe when he was in the room." Their romance was a storybook affair, but one that unfolded against the terrifying backdrop of World War II. Poppy, as George was known to his family, had already enlisted in the U.S. Navy and was set to begin his pilot training. Their courtship took place largely through the mail, a stream of letters that crossed the country, filled with the hopes and fears of two young people in love in a world at war. Barbara became the keeper of his story, following his progress from one training base to another. In the summer of 1944, before he shipped out to the Pacific, they became secretly engaged. The future was a terrifying unknown. He was heading into the most dangerous theater of the war as a torpedo bomber pilot, one of the most perilous jobs in the military. On September 2, 1944, Barbara's worst fears were nearly realized. On a mission over the Pacific island of Chichijima, George's plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire. With the engine ablaze, he completed his bombing run and then bailed out, the last man to escape the burning aircraft. His two crewmates were killed. He floated alone in the ocean for hours, sick and terrified, before he was miraculously rescued by an American submarine, the USS Finback. For a month, Barbara and the Bush family had no idea if he was alive or dead. The agonizing wait, the fear of that knock on the door, was an experience that would instill in her a deep and abiding hatred of war and a profound appreciation for the fragility of life. When George finally came home on leave for Christmas in 1944, there was no more waiting. Barbara, had already made the most significant decision of her young life. She had dropped out of Smith College. The life of intellectual pursuit, the future she might have carved out for herself, was laid aside. Her future was with this man, the young war hero, who had so nearly been taken from her. They were married on January 6, 1945, at the First Presbyterian Church in Rye. She was just 19 years old. The wedding was a beautiful, hurried affair, a moment of joy snatched from the jaws of a global conflict. Barbara wore a classic ivory satin gown, and George was in his handsome dress blue navy uniform. For a brief moment, they were just two young people in love, surrounded by their families, embarking on a new life together. But the wedding was more than just a personal commitment. It was a pivot point. It was the moment Barbara Pierce, the promising Smith College student from Rye, officially became Barbara Bush, the wife of a future oil man, congressman, ambassador, CIA, director, vice president, and president of the United States. She was stepping out of her own story and into his. The last debutante of Rye had made her choice, and in doing so, had set the course for a journey that would take her to the very center of American power, a journey that would bring her immense joy and a depth of sorrow she could not yet possibly imagine. The wedding in January 1945 was a fleeting moment of storybook romance, a beautiful pause before the realities of a new life and a new world set in. For Barbara Bush, the end of the Second World War did not mean a return to the comfortable, predictable life she had known in Rye, New York. Her new husband, George, was a man of restless ambition, a war hero decorated for his bravery, who now felt the quiet life of East Coast finance and inherited position was a suit that did not fit. After graduating from Yale in a remarkable 2.5 years, he made a decision that was, for their families, both shocking and bewildering. He turned down a lucrative job on Wall Street, packed their belongings into a red Studebaker, and with his pregnant wife by his side, headed west. Their destination was a dusty, sun-scorched, and utterly foreign land, the oil fields of West Texas. For Barbara, the 19-year-old former Smith College student who had grown up with maids and manicured lawns, it was like moving to another planet. This was the true beginning of her education, a crash course in resilience, adaptability, and the harsh realities of life that would strip away the last vestiges of the debutante and forge the steely matriarch the world would come to know. The West Texas of the late 1940s was the heart of the American post-war boom, a raw, optimistic, and unforgiving landscape. Towns like Odessa and Midland were exploding overnight, rough and tumble boom towns filled with wildcatters, roughnecks, and ambitious young men like George Bush, all hoping to strike it rich in the vast Permian Basin. The landscape was a monotonous, flat expanse of mesquite and dust, where the summer heat was a physical blow and the wind seemed to never stop blowing. For a woman accustomed to the lush greenery and coastal breezes of the Long Island Sound, it was a profound culture shock. Their first home was a world away from the sprawling Pierce estate in Rye. It was a tiny duplex, a so-called shotgun house on a block with other aspiring oil families. In a story that would become a cornerstone of the Bush family lore, a testament to their humble beginnings, their first neighbors, with whom they shared a single bathroom, were a mother and daughter who worked as prostitutes. It's easy to imagine the scene. The polite, well-mannered young woman from Rye, a graduate of the exclusive Ashley Hall, having to coordinate her morning routine with the ladies next door. Barbara, with the pragmatic humor that would become her trademark, took it all in stride. She was no longer a society girl waiting for life to happen. She was a pioneer wife, actively building a new life from scratch in a place that could not have been more alien to her. She had to learn everything. She had never cooked a meal, balanced a checkbook, or managed a household on her own. Now, in the Texas heat, she learned to be a homemaker, a wife, and soon after their arrival, a mother. In July 1946, their first son, George Walker Bush, was born. Barbara's new reality was a cycle of diapers, dust, and devotion to a husband who worked grueling hours, often leaving her alone for long stretches in a strange and isolating town. The early years of their marriage were defined by this constant motion, a nomadic existence that saw them move nearly 30 times in their first few decades together. Barbara became an expert at packing up a life and reassembling it in a new house in a new town, creating a sense of home and stability for her growing family amidst the relentless upheaval. She was the constant, the anchor, the unwavering center of a world in perpetual motion. But just as she was finding her footing in this new life, a devastating blow struck from the world she had left behind. In September of 1949, while she was pregnant with their second child, she received a phone call that shattered her. Her mother, Pauline Pierce, was dead. It wasn't an illness. It was a sudden, violent, and horrifically tragic accident. Her father had been driving and in a moment of distraction had crashed their car into a stone wall. Pauline, who had been reaching down to the floor of the car, was killed instantly. The shock and grief were immense, but for Barbara, the trauma was compounded by a medical decision that, while well-intentioned, was almost medieval in its cruelty. Because of her advanced pregnancy, her doctors, fearing the emotional and physical strain of the journey, strictly forbade her from traveling from Texas to New York to attend her own mother's funeral. She was forced to grieve alone 1,000 miles away, denied the closure of a final goodbye, haunted by the image of her father having to bury his wife, a tragedy he had inadvertently caused. The pain and stress of this period were so profound that she would later point to it as the moment her light brown hair began its rapid transformation to the snow-white color that would become her signature. It was an outward manifestation of a deep internal wound, a grief she was forced to swallow whole, a trauma that taught her the hard lesson of enduring the unbearable in silence. A few months later, in December 1949, a moment of profound joy broke through the darkness. Barbara gave birth to their first daughter, a beautiful baby girl they named Pauline Robinson Pierce Bush, in honor of the mother she had just lost. From the beginning, they called her Robin. She was, by all accounts, a magical child. Her parents adored her, and her older brother, George W., was her devoted protector. In her memoirs, Barbara would describe Robin as a ray of sunshine, a witty, joyful, and deeply loving little girl who filled their small Texas home with laughter. She was the quiet, funny, sweet, beautiful copy of her handsome father, Barbara wrote. For 3 blissful years, Robin was the undisputed center of their universe, a symbol of hope and a balm for the still fresh wound of Pauline's death. The Bush family was complete, a perfect portrait of post-war American optimism. In the spring of 1953, the portrait was irrevocably destroyed. 3-year-old Robin, who had been feeling listless and unwell, was taken to the family doctor in Midland. After a series of tests, the doctor sat Barbara and George down in his office and delivered a verdict that was, in that era, a death sentence. Robin had advanced leukemia. The doctor's advice was as brutal as the diagnosis. There was no cure, no hope. He told them to take their daughter home, to make her comfortable, to love her, and to let her die in peace. For Barbara and George, accepting this fate was simply not an option. It was a rejection of the very optimism and fighting spirit that defined them. They refused to give up. An uncle, a doctor in New York, arranged for Robin to be admitted to what is now the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, one of the premier institutions in the world for cancer research. Leaving 4-year-old George W. with relatives, they flew with Robin to New York, clinging to a sliver of hope that the experimental treatments offered there might produce a miracle. What followed was 7 months of a special kind of hell, a grueling odyssey of hope and despair that would test the limits of their endurance. They lived in a small apartment provided by a family friend, and their entire existence was reduced to the confines of a hospital room. Barbara remained in New York the entire time, never leaving her daughter's side. Her life became a relentless cycle of hospital visits, agonizing treatments, and a desperate, gut-wrenching performance of cheerfulness. She made the difficult decision to never tell Robin how sick she was, to shield her from the terrifying truth of her own mortality. She created a bubble of normalcy in the sterile hospital environment, reading stories, playing games, and talking about the future, all while her own heart was breaking. George flew back and forth, a torturous commute between two worlds. In Texas, he had to work to support the family and pay the mounting medical bills, and he had to be a father to their young son, who was confused and scared by his parents' and sisters' sudden absence. In New York, he had to be the pillar of strength for his wife, watching his beloved daughter endure painful bone marrow aspirations and the ravages of a disease they could not stop. The treatments were brutal, and they provided no miracle. In October of 1953, after 7 months of fighting, Robin died in her parents' arms, just shy of her 4th birthday. They had her buried back in the world she had never had a chance to know, in a small family plot in Greenwich, Connecticut. The death of her child plunged Barbara into a profound, dark, and all-consuming depression. The stoicism and strength she had cultivated her entire life crumbled. She described it as a physical pain, an ache so deep it felt as if her own body was shutting down. She would be driving the car and suddenly be overwhelmed by such a wave of grief that she would have to pull over, unable to see through her tears. She found it impossible to be the mother her son, George W., needed her to be. Her grief was a fortress, and she was its lonely prisoner. George, who was processing his own immense sorrow by throwing himself into his work, tried desperately to reach her, but she was inconsolable. It was, in the end, her 7-year-old son who inadvertently saved her. One afternoon, a friend came to the door and asked if George W. could come out and play. She overheard her son's reply, "No, I can't. I have to play with my mother. She's been sad." That innocent, heartbreaking sentence was, for Barbara, a thunderclap. It pierced through the fog of her grief and made her realize that in her sorrow she was abandoning the child she still had. It was a brutal, necessary awakening. The loss of Robin would shape the rest of her life in ways both public and private. It gave her an almost supernatural empathy for anyone who was suffering, especially parents who had lost a child. It fueled her lifelong passionate support for cancer research, but it also fundamentally altered her personality. A part of her had died with Robin, and in its place grew a kind of protective armor. The softness of her youth was replaced by a steely resolve. She had looked into the abyss, had endured the single worst thing that can happen to a parent, and she had survived. The carefree debutante from Rye was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who now understood the profound depths of human sorrow, a woman who had learned to carry an impossible weight. This hard-won, heartbreaking strength would be the foundation upon which the rest of her extraordinary life would be built. The death of a child is a sorrow that never truly ends. It is a weight that is carried for a lifetime. For Barbara Bush, the grief over her daughter Robin was a permanent landscape, a quiet, gray backdrop to the rest of her days. But in the years that followed that unimaginable loss, something remarkable happened. The raw, debilitating pain was slowly, painstakingly transformed. It was not forgotten, but forged into a new kind of fuel. The profound sorrow carved out a depth of empathy in her, while the act of surviving it built a shell of almost unbreakable, steely resolve. The softness of the young debutante from Rye was now permanently encased in the armor of a survivor. It was this new, formidable combination of compassion and toughness that she would carry with her as she stepped out of the private world of family grief and into the bright, brutal, and unforgiving arena of American politics. The grieving mother was about to become the political matriarch, the quiet partner in the forging of a dynasty, and the woman who would earn the most feared and respected title in Washington, the enforcer. The transition began in the late 1950s as George H.W. Bush's fortunes in the oil business soared. He had become a millionaire by the age of 40, and with financial success came the freedom to pursue the calling that had been in his blood all along, public service. The family moved from the dusty plains of Midland to the burgeoning, sophisticated metropolis of Houston, a city that would become their permanent home base. It was from here that George launched his first major political campaign, a run for the U.S. Senate in 1964. For Barbara, this was a whole new world. The life of an oil man's wife was demanding, but the life of a political candidate's wife was all-consuming. The campaign was a grueling statewide affair, and it ended in defeat, but it was a crucial training ground. Barbara learned the mechanics of modern politics, the endless handshaking, the fundraising dinners, the necessity of remembering names and faces, and the brutal reality of public criticism. She discovered she had a natural talent for it. She was organized, disciplined, and possessed a disarming, down-to-earth charm that voters found incredibly appealing. 2 years later, in 1966, George ran for a newly created congressional seat in Houston and won. The Bushes were going to Washington. For Barbara, this was a return to the East Coast world she understood. But now she was entering it not as a society girl, but as a key political player. She was far more than just the supportive spouse who smiled for the cameras. She became an indispensable part of her husband's operation. In an era before computers and databases, she created an elaborate card catalog system, meticulously recording the name and personal details of every single person she and George met. This incredible memory for people and their stories became a legendary political asset, allowing the Bushes to build a vast and intensely loyal network of friends and supporters. While living in Washington, she even wrote a regular newspaper column for the Houston Chronicle called Washington Scene, giving constituents a charming insider's look at life in the capital. All the while, she continued to manage a growing family. Her last 3 children, Neil, Marvin, and Dorothy, were born during this period of intense political activity. She was juggling the demands of motherhood with the relentless schedule of a congressional wife. It was during these years that another private family struggle would shape her future public work. Her son Neil was a bright and energetic boy, but he struggled terribly in school. After a long and frustrating search for answers, he was diagnosed with dyslexia. Barbara threw herself into understanding his learning disability, working tirelessly with his teachers, and learning everything she could about how to help him. The experience was a profound awakening. She saw how a person's entire future could be derailed by the inability to read, and the seeds of her lifelong crusade for literacy were planted. The early 1970s saw George's career skyrocket, and with it, Barbara's life became a whirlwind of new roles and new challenges. President Richard Nixon appointed him U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, and the family moved to New York City, living in a grand apartment at the Waldorf Astoria. Barbara was now a diplomat's wife, hosting foreign dignitaries and navigating the complex, high-stakes world of international politics. After the UN, George became the chairman of the Republican National Committee during the darkest days of the Watergate scandal, a thankless, high-pressure job that required all of their combined political skills to navigate. The most profound and personally challenging chapter of this period came in 1974. President Gerald Ford offered George two prestigious ambassadorships to London or to Paris. Instead, George chose a far more difficult and obscure posting. He asked to be sent to the People's Republic of China. At the time, the U.S. had no formal diplomatic relations with the communist nation. The post was a liaison office, a tentative first step toward normalizing relations. For Barbara, the move to Beijing was the greatest culture shock of her life. They lived in a Spartan government-issued house, surrounded by the gray, oppressive atmosphere of Mao Zedong's China. The city was a sea of bicycles and blue Mao suits, a place where they were constantly watched and their movements were restricted. It was a period of profound isolation, but also of unexpected personal growth. With her children grown and out of the house, Barbara, for the first time in her adult life, was on her own. She immersed herself in Chinese culture, studying the language, the art, and the history. She famously explored the city on her bicycle, a solitary, anonymous figure pedaling through the ancient alleyways, a world away from the country clubs of Rye or the political salons of Washington. But the loneliness was immense. It was during this time in China that she began to feel the first creeping tendrils of a darkness that would later consume her. The darkness intensified when they returned to Washington in 1976 for George's most secretive and stressful job yet, director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA was in turmoil, reeling from public scandals and congressional investigations. George's job was to restore morale and integrity to the beleaguered agency. But the very nature of the work was a wall between them. He could not speak about his day, about the crises he was managing, about the secrets he was keeping. For Barbara, who had been his partner and confidant in every other aspect of his career, this exclusion was devastating. This professional isolation coincided with a period of deep personal crisis. She was in her early 50s, experiencing the hormonal and emotional upheaval of menopause. Her children had all left home, leaving her with a profound sense of empty nest syndrome. She felt purposeless and deeply alone. And it was during this vulnerable period that a toxic and persistent rumor began to circulate, a whisper campaign that would haunt her for years. It was the allegation that her husband George was having an affair with a younger female aide, Jennifer Fitzgerald. The rumors were never substantiated, and the Bushes always vehemently denied them. But in the insular, gossip-fueled world of Washington, the whispers were relentless. For Barbara, the stories, whether true or not, were a devastating blow to her sense of security and her identity as a wife. The combination of all these pressures, the loneliness, the hormonal changes, the empty nest, and the ugly rumors, plundered her into the second Great Depression of her life. It was a terrifying, all-consuming darkness, far worse than the grief she had felt after Robin's death. As she later confessed in her memoirs, with shocking candor, there were days when the pain was so intense she would pull her car over to the side of the road and simply sit, overwhelmed by despair. "I would feel the misery of the world," she wrote. She even admitted to entertaining thoughts of crashing her car into a tree or an oncoming truck, not out of a desire to commit suicide, but from a desperate, overwhelming wish for the pain to simply stop. George, seeing her suffering, begged her to seek professional psychiatric help. But Barbara, a product of a generation that believed in handling one's own problems with quiet stoicism, refused. It was a decision she would come to deeply regret. Instead of therapy, she fought the darkness on her own, throwing herself into volunteer work and public speaking, using activity and service as a lifeline to pull herself back into the light. She emerged from this personal hell just in time to face the biggest political fight of their lives, the 1980 presidential campaign, where George ran for the Republican nomination and ultimately became Ronald Reagan's vice president. For the next 8 years, Barbara served as the Second Lady of the United States. It was her first taste of life on the national stage, and she navigated it with a style that was uniquely her own. She was the antithesis of the glamorous, high-fashion First Lady, Nancy Reagan. Their relationship was famously frosty, a quiet clash of two very different personalities and worldviews. While Nancy was known for her designer gowns and expensive renovations of the White House, Barbara was famous for her down-to-earth pragmatism, her comfortable clothes, and her self-deprecating humor about her white hair and wrinkles. It was as Second Lady that she found her public voice. She made the cause of family literacy her own, traveling tens of thousands of miles across the country and around the world, visiting schools and literacy programs. She used her platform not for personal aggrandizement, but to shine a bright, unwavering light on an issue that had touched her own family so deeply. But she also began to solidify her reputation as the enforcer. She was fiercely protective of her husband and quick to shut down any criticism of him or their children. Her tongue could be famously sharp. During the 1984 campaign, she made a controversial off-the-cuff remark about her husband's vice presidential opponent, Geraldine Ferraro, a comment for which she later had to apologize. It was a glimpse of the iron fist inside the velvet glove, a sign that this warm, grandmotherly figure was also a political warrior who would do whatever it took to defend her family. By the time George H.W. Bush secured the Republican presidential nomination in 1988, Barbara was no longer just the candidate's wife. She was a seasoned, formidable, and immensely popular political figure in her own right. She had survived the nomadic life of the oil fields, the unimaginable grief of losing a child, the lonely isolation of a diplomat's wife, and a secret battle with a crippling depression. Each trial had added a layer of steel to her spine. She was now ready for the final, greatest test of her life, to become the First Lady of the United States. She was no longer just a partner in the forging of a dynasty. She was its co-architect and its most powerful guardian. On a crisp, cold January day in 1989, Barbara Bush stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol and watched her husband, George H.W. Bush, take the oath of office as the 41st President of the United States. She was 63 years old. For more than 4 decades, she had been the loyal soldier, the tireless campaigner, the supportive wife, and the fierce guardian of her husband's ambitions. She had packed and unpacked their lives nearly 30 times, raised 5 children through the turbulence of the 20th century, and navigated the treacherous social and political waters of Washington with a steady hand. She had endured unimaginable private grief and battled her own secret demons, all while presenting a face of unshakable strength to the world. Now, after a lifetime spent in a supporting role, she was stepping into the spotlight herself. The enforcer had arrived in the East Wing, and she was about to redefine the role of First Lady in a way that only she could. Her tenure began with a clear and deliberate break from the past. The preceding 8 years of the Reagan administration had been defined by Hollywood glamour, high fashion, and a sense of opulent formality. Her immediate predecessor, Nancy Reagan, was a woman of impeccable, high-fashion style. Barbara Bush was, and had always been, unapologetically herself. She famously wore a pair of $29 shoes to her husband's inaugural ball, a clear signal that the era of designer gowns and extravagant spending was over. She embraced her public image as America's grandmother, famously quipping about her wrinkles and her snow-white hair. The pearls are to hide the wrinkles, but they're not working. This self-deprecating humor and down-to-earth authenticity were a breath of fresh air, and the American public adored her for it. Her approval ratings consistently soared above her husband's, making her one of the most popular first ladies in modern history. But beneath the warm, grandmotherly exterior, she was a woman on a mission. She had seen firsthand, through her son Neil's struggles with dyslexia, how illiteracy could devastate a life. She understood that it was not just an educational issue, but a root cause of poverty, crime, and social inequality. She had spent her 8 years as second lady tirelessly advocating for the cause. But now, with the full power and prestige of the White House behind her, she could take her fight to a whole new level. In 1989, she founded the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy. Her approach was innovative and holistic. She understood that a child's literacy was inextricably linked to their parents. The foundation championed programs that taught parents and children together, breaking the intergenerational cycle of illiteracy. She was a relentless and effective advocate. She used the White House as a bully pulpit, hosting events, giving hundreds of speeches, and traveling across the country to visit literacy programs in inner-city schools and rural communities. She even became a best-selling author in her own right. She wrote See Fred's Story, a children's book, from the perspective of their family's Cocker Spaniel, and later, Millie's book, from the viewpoint of their famous English Springer Spaniel. These charming books raised over $1 million, every cent of which was donated to her literacy foundation. She proved that a First Lady could be both warm and deeply substantive, using her platform not for self-promotion, but for a cause that would change the lives of millions. Behind the scenes, she remained her husband's most trusted advisor and fiercest defender. During a presidency that saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the First Gulf War, she was his sounding board, his confidant, and his anchor. She was famously protective, and her sharp tongue was often deployed against those she felt were unfairly criticizing her husband or their children. She was the matriarch of the first family, in every sense of the word. Her influence felt in every corner of the White House. Yet even at the pinnacle of power, she remained a complex and sometimes contradictory figure. While she was publicly the loyal wife of a conservative president, her private views remained more progressive. She quietly let it be known that she was pro-choice on abortion, a position that put her directly at odds with the official platform of the Republican Party. She navigated this delicate dance with political skill, never openly challenging her husband, but making her own convictions clear to those who were paying attention. Her life in the White House was the ultimate expression of the persona she had cultivated over a lifetime, a perfect balance of public loyalty and private, fiercely held independence. The dream of a second term was cut short by the 1992 election loss to Bill Clinton. For George, the defeat was a crushing blow. For Barbara, it was a moment to once again be the family's source of strength, managing her husband's disappointment with grace and dignity. As they left the White House in January 1993, many assumed they were heading into a quiet, well-deserved retirement. But for the matriarch of the Bush dynasty, a new and equally demanding role was just beginning, that of first mother. They settled into a comfortable life between their home in Houston and their beloved family compound in Kennebunkport, Maine. But there was little time for rest. The political ambitions of their sons, George W. and Jeb, were taking flight. Barbara seamlessly transitioned into her new role as the chief cheerleader and behind-the-scenes advisor for the next generation. She was a tireless campaigner for George W. in his successful run for governor of Texas, and later for president in 2000, and for Jeb in his gubernatorial races in Florida. She was one of the most popular and effective surrogates the Republican Party had, but she did it with a growing sense of ambivalence. She had seen the brutal personal cost of life at the top, and she worried deeply about the toll it would take on her sons and their families. During her son's 8 years as president, she navigated the difficult role of being the mother of the most powerful man in the world. She witnessed the horrors of September 11, 2001, and the subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. As a woman who had nearly lost her own husband in a war and who deeply hated conflict, this period would have been one of immense private anxiety. She once again found herself in the position of having to publicly defend a president she loved from a storm of controversy and criticism. It was in her later years, after her son had left office, that she finally seemed to feel a sense of freedom. She became more candid and outspoken than ever before. In 2013, when talk of her son Jeb running for president began to surface, she famously told an interviewer, "We've had enough Bushes." It was a moment of shocking frankness, a glimpse into her deep fatigue with the relentless demands of the political dynasty she had helped create. In her final memoir, Reflections, she revealed even more of the private woman behind the public facade. It was in this book that she told the startling and controversial story of how, after one of her miscarriages, she had brought the fetus home in a jar to show her son George W., a raw, visceral attempt to teach him about the reality of life and loss. It was a story that horrified many, but it was also a window into the soul of a woman who was unflinchingly pragmatic, deeply shaped by her own grief, and determined to confront the hardest truths of life head-on. As she entered her 90s, her formidable strength began to wane. She suffered from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, and congestive heart failure. Her final years were marked by a series of hospitalizations, often alongside her beloved husband, whose own health was failing. Their enduring 73-year love story became a source of national inspiration, a final testament to their unwavering partnership. In April of 2018, following yet another health crisis, the 92-year-old matriarch made her last great executive decision. After consulting with her family, she chose to refuse any further aggressive medical treatment. She opted instead for comfort care, choosing to spend her final days at home, surrounded by the family that had been the central project of her entire life. It was a decision of immense courage and profound dignity, a final act of control from a woman who had faced death head-on as a young mother and was not afraid to face it again. She had a deep and abiding faith, and she spoke often of her belief that the first person she would see in the afterlife would be her daughter, Robin. Barbara Bush died peacefully at her home on April 17, 2018. Her funeral was a moving bipartisan tribute, a gathering of the nation's political elite that included 4 former presidents, all there to honor a woman who had been a fixture in their lives for decades. She was laid to rest at the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library in College Station, Texas, buried beside the little girl she had lost 65 years earlier. Her husband, her partner in a lifetime's journey, would follow her just 7 months later, laid to rest beside her and their daughter. In the end, the legacy of Barbara Bush is far more complex than that of a simple, grandmotherly First Lady. Her true legacy is one of resilience. She was a woman who absorbed an almost unthinkable amount of grief, the loss of her mother, the death of her child, the silent struggle with depression. And she did not just endure it, she transformed it. She converted her pain into a profound empathy that fueled a lifetime of service. Her story is a powerful, poignant reminder that the most formidable public figures are often shaped by their most private sorrows. She was the last debutante of a lost world, a political enforcer, a first lady, and a matriarch. But most of all, she was a survivor, a woman of quiet, unshakable strength whose life was a testament to the enduring power of choosing, against all odds, to be happy.